I just don't know where I am at the moment. Dexter here, Dexter there. Just when I thought they were going to go easy on podcasters and YouTubers and other content creators over Christmas, we get 3 episodes instead of 2. I'm sorry if I misled anyone last time with what I thought was going to happen. We got some, or maybe I got some duff information, or maybe I just didn't read stuff properly. But anyway, it certainly rattled my plans over what is always a very busy period at the best of times. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Gareth and you're listening to Dissecting Dexter, coming to you from the studio in the heart of Yorkshire, England, where we're here to talk about Original Sin, of course. It's December the 30th as I speak to you. Still Christmas time in my book. I don't start to come down really until after New Year, so we've still got our tree and all the decorations up in the house. It's such a short time, isn't it? We like to make the most of it here. Some people take their stuff down on Boxing Day, but I just can't understand that. But each to their own, eh? So, yeah, the podcast, the broadcast schedule upset the apple cart a bit, and I've really struggled to find time to podcast. What we're doing today is covering your feedback for episode 2. I've got you got my review for it last week, but we'll find out what you thought. We'll also go through your feedback for episode 3, and through that I'll also provide some of my own thoughts on the episode. So this won't be the usual format, but hopefully we'll do justice to the show. Then again, hopefully we'll get back to the normal format for episode 4, which has already aired, of course, as we speak. But I won't be referring to stuff that happens there today. So if you're listening to these podcasts as you go along, it's spoiler free. Then we've got episode 5 later this week. Bloody hell, there's no let up, is there? I'll do my best, but please bear with me if podcasts don't get done so promptly. But we'll get back on track very soon. Let's crack on and chat about episodes 2 and 3, shall we? Episode 2, of course, was Kid in a Candy Store, and we talked about that last week, while episode 3 was Miami Vice, written by Safura Fadavi and directed by Monica Raymond. For me, Miami Vice is the best episode of the season so far. Loads happened, some good character moments, some classic Dexter on the hunt stuff. We got a kill of the week, there were developments in Miami Metro, domestic strife, it was all there. The investigation, the stalk and the hunt of Tony Ferrer was a lot of fun. He was a physically imposing guy, but Dexter got the better of him. I loved the way he got him to share a bullet from his gun and proved his guilt. The slow-mo as the bullet flies past his ear was a wonderful moment. We'll talk more about the kill itself when we get into the feedback. However, the hand popping up in the swamp at the end suggests we've not heard the last of Handsome Tony. I wonder if it will force Harry to lose some evidence down the line. I'm enjoying the Harry flashbacks, something we'll also talk about in a bit. But we know none of it's going to come to any good, and the only result will be tragedy and suffering. We see a bit more of the kidnapping of the judge's son. I'm finding it really upsetting. I don't like stuff with kids. The captor leaves the cell door open like he wanted the boy to wander out, perhaps with a false sense of hope, which harks back to New Blood, of course. And then the kid wanders out and he goes into another room and it sounded like he was getting the shit beaten out of him, which thankfully we didn't have to see, but the sounds were bad enough. God almighty. I wondered last time if the abductor was masked for the boys' benefit or ours as viewers, and I'm thinking now it might have been the latter. I can't say I'm massively interested in the Deb becoming captain storyline, although for her as a teenage girl, being neglected by her dad, having already lost her mum, it gives her a goal to aim for, and achieving something like that would be validating, which I think she needs. although she's resorting to some shady shit to get there, roping in Dexter to make some faux cocaine for her friends, which they all snort a bit too hungrily for my liking. I was a teenager in 1991 and I wouldn't have touched the stuff, but that's me. I was amused how Dexter knew a chemistry recipe to make a cocaine substitute. He certainly ingratiated himself with Deb, and heaven knows their relationship needs some work, mainly because of Dexter, to be fair. I also found it funny when Dexter couldn't take his eyes off Sophia, but of course he was looking at the earrings when Sophia was wearing them. Some of the best situational comedy comes from misunderstandings, doesn't it? And this was a classic one for Dexter. Having no romantic interest whatsoever, he just wants his precious back. And I'm not going to do a Gollum impression, so don't worry about that. Elsewhere, we welcomed Maria LaGuerta to the show. Again, we'll talk about her in a bit, but her passage through Miami Metro is not going to be smooth, is it? And she ruffles some feathers immediately. I did like Harry being open to working with her, despite her public criticism of the department, something that royally pissed off Captain Spencer. I think Harry was quietly impressed with her, and I'm looking forward to seeing how their working relationship progresses, and whether it maybe sets him at odds with the captain down the line. He could be forced to choose between what's right and his friendship with Spencer. I did smile when Batista immediately started flirting with her, though. All right, let's hear a bit about what you guys thought. We've got a voicemail first from Nikki.
Hey Gareth, this is Nikki from Portland, Oregon. This will probably be a long voicemail, just FYI, it's a bit scattered and stream of consciousness, so I apologize in advance. I binged the original series of Dexter only this year. I only watched it because I also binged 6 Feet Under, and it became my number one favorite show of all time. And I fell in love with Michael C. Hall, so I knew then that I had to watch Dexter. I wasn't expecting Dexter to become my second favorite show of all time. While binging the series, I also binged this show, Dissecting Dexter, and I've loved listening to this little community of people talking about the show and look forward every time you and Travis spoke. So that being said, this is my first time being able to become an active part of this journey with everyone. I tend to agree with you more than anyone, Gareth, and be very forgiving regarding things that some fans usually nitpick. I think that some suspension of disbelief is essential for the storyline of any fictionalized TV show to create plot devices for an interesting and suspenseful show. I do, however, naturally yearn for the same level of tightness as seasons 1 through 4, and I realize that probably the only reason that people get hung up on these tiny details, like the infamous M99 versus ketamine controversy, etc., is because people love the show so much and just want the show to be on par with seasons 1 through 4 and want better for it. But sometimes Dexter fans go way overboard with the nitpicks. Do they actually enjoy the show if they want to suck the life out of it? If you want a completely factual, detailed television show, I think they should stick to watching Forensic Files. It would be so dry and boring if the writers didn't take some creative liberties here, and there wouldn't be the show that we all love. I do love hearing everyone's feedback, though, when they're nuanced takes that appreciate and focus on the storytelling. It makes me feel really bad for people like Scott Reynolds, who put so much work into it and who is so proud of it, to only have Dexter fans nitpick it to death and undermine his work. I do agree with the season 6 through 8 criticisms for obvious reasons, as that was just lazy writing and lack of care and respect for the show. That being said, the only gripe I have with Original Sin is some of the revisionist history that's happening that a lot of people caught and mentioned in your last episode. Does anyone know where Matthews is? I was under the impression that Matthews was a part of Miami Metro when Dexter was rescued from the shipping container. And when Tom Matthews, in the original series, came over to Dexter's house, I think on Deb's birthday, and delivered some pretty bad news to Harry. I forgot exactly what that was, but I knew that Matthews was his superior. Anyway, so I think if you're gonna reshoot scenes from the original series and include them in Original Sin, they should be carbon copies for continuity's sake, and respect for the story. Speaking of, I think people who say, for example, we don't need to see these scenes again, like Nurse Mary's death and Deb pushing Harry in the wheelchair in the hospital, etc. We already knew that. Don't think about Original Sin as a show itself, and it would be confusing without showing these scenes again. For example, not showing Nurse Mary's murder again would make Dexter, with his first trophies, the earrings, and the way he dumped his initial kills, not make sense at all for Original Sin, which are essential to include, of course, or else it wouldn't be a prequel. Also, I just love the callbacks and revisits. I do, however, love the additions to these scenes, and it makes Dexter's world so much more layered and just make more sense. I love Dex in med school before landing on Miami Metro. It's showing when Dexter missed Deb's game with no real remorse, but her showing up for him for his graduation. And it really sets the scene just to show how Deb selflessly loved her family while Dexter was selfish for the rest of her life and ultimately ruined her. Also showing that Harry had a son before Dexter Jr., and this is why he paid so much more attention to Dexter versus Deb, and with Harry just ultimately trying to right the wrongs for his neglect to soothe his guilt. And it reminded me of Dexter trying to do that with Lumen after Rita's death. Also, I just love how you got to see the progression of Harry's regret as he realized that nothing would totally fix Dexter's urges. He knew that he would definitely become a serial killer. And I must say that Christian Slater does a really good job at showing Harry's slow realization that he's failed so many people that were important to him, like his first son, his wife, Deb, Laura Moser, and Dexter. And it also mirrored Dexter's arc so much, like ultimately failing everyone that was close to him due to ultimately him being selfish. But yeah, so far I love Original Sin because it just adds so much more to the Dexterverse and provides a lot more context to everything. And I'm always here for anything Dexter, so ultimately I'll take it all. I love New Blood too, especially the atmosphere that it created with the very carefully chosen songs like Avalanche by Leonard Cohen. Because if you look at the lyrics to that song, it described exactly what was happening with Dexter and Harrison at the time and made it just so much more emotional and impactful. Almost like it was written for the series instead of 50 years ago when Leonard wrote it. It also made me feel physically cold. In Original Sin, the atmosphere and the music plops me right back into 1991 and made me feel very nostalgic as somebody who was 5 in 1991 and grew up in Florida myself. I also liked how accurate they are to the times of being non-PC, however, calling out in the same breath just how problematic that time was. For like example, no human involved, while also segueing into how LaGuardia started out fighting for a noble cause to fix that and being of actual use before she ultimately turns into the condescending wannabe politician who I don't think ever actually solved a case in her life and only states the obvious when attempting to. Anyways, So yeah, Original Sin by itself so far is pretty good. However, I know that with anything Dexter, it does take some time to build up in the first act before it ramps up, and I'm hoping for that soon. So those are my thoughts for now, and I am very excited for what's to come. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nikki. So glad to have you aboard. Travis will be very happy that you enjoy his feedback. He's a Dexter legend in my book. And I have to say, I'm in awe of his knowledge of the Dexter minutiae. I am perhaps a bit more forgiving of the show and far less extreme in my reactions if there's something I'm not a fan of. It's fashionable, isn't it, when a show's maybe not doing so well, to jump on the bandwagon and bash it. You know, we've seen it recently with the Star Wars TV shows. They're easy prey. This is just a TV show at the end of the day, and the creators are telling us the story they want to tell. We can choose to like it or not, but I appreciate it's a show we all get wrapped up in and care about, so, you know, it's fine for people to be passionate. What I didn't like, in fact, I was completely appalled, was after New Blood and the disgusting hate that people like Scott Reynolds received on social media. That was crossing the line in a huge way. So, where is Matthews? He must be around somewhere, and I'm sure we'll get to see him at some point. We've heard a lot lately about inconsistencies between what we saw in flashbacks in the original series and what we're seeing now, and we've got some feedback to come from other people who point out some more of these. I think we can give the writers a good deal of leeway here, though, because during the original run, they'd have had absolutely no idea or inkling that there'd eventually be a prequel series. The old flashbacks were just making a quick point, in and out, show us something from Dexter's past, and not thinking too much about the finer details there. Like Deb's portrayal. I mean, she's obviously far more plucky and feisty now, unlike the more nerdy one we got originally. Now they have to think about what would be more effective dramatically for a TV series, and that means retconning or rehashing elements that they've shown before, hopefully for the better. You make a nice point, Nikki, about Harry reflecting Dexter's arc in that he too carries the unbearable weight of failing people he cared about and who cared for him. They pile on, and we know how that will end up for Harry, or we assume it will end the same way. And for Dexter, why he sailed his boat into a hurricane, for better or worse, in Season 8, or why he took a bullet for his son in New Blood. Thanks, Nikki. Hope to hear from you again. Mamoon emailed with some quick-fire thoughts. He says, first of all, the show feels low stakes compared to the original show. They should do what Better Call Saul did, give us characters to care about that we don't know the fate of to make it more suspenseful, like Kim Wexler, Nacho, Lalo Salamanca, Howard and Chuck, etc. Now we know where Dexter got the idea to bring the donuts. Him bringing veggies was so freaking funny. Great way to show the awkwardness of Dexter's social skills. When he pulled out the earrings, I thought he was going to pleasure himself to those, but thankfully I didn't have to fast forward. You and me both. Mamoon also says we know why Deb felt so alone. Harry is such a horrible father to her. Thanks, Mamoon. You raise a good point about the low stakes of the show, comparing it to Better Call Saul. No spoilers for that show, which is amazing by the way, but it's the point of another prequel show that introduced us to and built up new characters that we were really interested in or really cared about but didn't know their fates. For Dexter, these people are very limited at the moment. Very limited. There's still time for them to develop and build up people like Bobby and Sophia and make us care about them. Like with Bobby, beyond just knowing he's Deb's godfather, or with Sophia, Deb's best friend. They're both likeable. But I can't say I care about them enough to be on the edge of my seat fearing for their safety. But there's still time for that to build. It's a good point though, but one that works the other way for my wife. She is far more comfortable watching this than New Blood because we know whatever trouble Dexter or Deb find themselves in, we know they'll live. It does take away an element of dramatic tension. That's absolutely true. So I would hope the writers are aware of this. I'm sure they are. And they'll be putting more into building these new characters to make us care for them. Mamoon also emailed thoughts about episode 3. He says, after episode 2, I thought the show is focusing more on Harry than Dexter. We already know so much about Dexter and Deb that I don't think they can inform us about much more, but they can definitely focus on Harry and why he made Dexter the way he is. This episode confirms that for me, showing us how much Harry used Dexter's mother for his gains, finding out his son is keeping trophies but doesn't follow him when out of nowhere he shows interest in a game I've never heard of. He gave a green signal to go and kill another man. This, I believe, is all to show the viewers the effects of Dexter on Harry. Elsewhere, Mamoon says, Captain Spencer versus LaGuerta's rivalry will be nice to see in the upcoming episodes. He also loved the confusion where Sophia was thinking Dexter was into her. And he asks, why is Dexter showing Deb how to make cocaine? She's so young and might get hooked. Oh wait, she does in the original show, after finding out Dexter is the Bay Harbor Butcher. Loved the shot of Dexter grinning as the bullet went past him. The ending of the episode shows us that someone will find Tony's hand, but we know Dexter doesn't get caught, so this is just going to show us how it affects Harry and how he avoids getting caught. Prediction, Dexter is going to get Sophia killed. Thanks, Mamoon. That's a good prediction. Sophia seems nice, but she's one of the new characters whose fate is unknown. Just thinking. I wonder if Dexter takes Sophia on a date while, in reality, he's actually scoping out a victim and using her for cover, and maybe he gets her killed in the process. That could happen. And that would be tragic for Deb, because that would be someone else she cares about that she loses. It sounds like you're suggesting Harry is being selfish, and I can see how you might think that. I think he's screwed up and deeply affected by losing a son and then his wife, and then the trauma of seeing what he led Laura into, which he probably knows caused Dexter to be the way he is. All that's in his head. He needs serious therapy, but as we know, his traumas are not over, not by a long shot. Thanks again, Mamoon. Patreon supporter Jennifer has emailed to say, just watched and rewatched episodes 2 and 3. I got to say that they have for sure captured that Miami vibe I love so much from OG Dexter. I've been seeing comments about all of the inconsistencies that exist between the two. All I can say is I'm taking this for what it is, watching new Dexter, and I am loving it. Episode 2 was a good episode. Learning more about the background characters was nice. Also a new Debism. Fuckosaurus Rex. Hilarious. Patrick Gibson is really doing a great job embodying Michael C. Hall as Dexter. Just the right creep factor. Nice tie-in too with Laura Moser and Joe Driscoll. Also the inception of the donut guy. Nice little thing to bring up. I think they're pulling out all the stops. I do have one thought. Where does Captain Matthews come into this? Episode 3 is my favourite episode so far. Dexter and his next kill and the cheek slice appearing on the Ferrer face from where the ball hit him was a nice callback. Also, making fake cocaine? What the hell, Dex? I'm also enjoying how nerdy and unsure of himself Dexter is in public. But by himself with his prey, he's stone cold and in control already. Someone else wondering where Tom Matthews is. He certainly knew Harry and knew young Dexter and Deb, so he must be along soon. I agree about the cut on the cheek being a lovely callback and foreshadowing at the same time. We know Dexter's going to refine his MO, and this was a nice Easter egg for us. Thanks, Jennifer. We got some long voicemails this week, but it's fine. We're covering 2 episodes for feedback this time, and I love to include different voices on the show, and it's especially great to hear from new people. Here's another one.
Hey, Gareth. This is Hans from Ohio, leaving feedback on episode 2, Kid in a Candy Store. I love the consistent flashbacks to the 70s. I know that maybe some people might not enjoy that, but I do love, I guess I'm pretty nostalgic as a person, and I do enjoy the different time eras and the distinctions that they had, whether it was vehicles or hairstyles, and I just love the way they're constantly incorporating, going back to the 70s, bringing back the memories of Dexter as a child, going back to the story of the origins of Laura Moser. I think that is pretty fun to watch. Even, I think I saw an appearance of Brian when Dexter was at the restaurant with his work colleagues. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was Brian. That was a pretty good cast, if so. It looked pretty identical to the original actor, so good job on that. Deb, again, Deb trying to get her dad into tofu. I guess some of the thoughts I had on that were, I remember growing up in the 90s, so I'm 43 years old right now. But growing up in the 80s and 90s, I do remember how much of a era it was for false health information, especially the push for low fat and things of that nature. And of course, demonizing red meat was a thing then. And I am very thankful, I think primarily because of the internet, we have information in that just totally debunks those false scientific myths of what was healthy and what was not. Of course, Harry smoking, definitely that was bad for his health. If he was drinking excessively with alcohol, of course, that's not good for your health either. I'm still not liking Deb. In the original series, her father, Harry, was a hero to her. She was very needy, and she was looking for his approval. And I remember the arguments she would have with Dexter when Dexter started to find information that showed he wasn't as good of a person as they both had thought he was. Deb was freaking out and fighting it, and I think that's because all her life she was viewing him as a hero. So I did think that it was very inconsistent with the original series to portray her the way they're portraying her now. Like, I don't know if there's some other explanation for it, but to me it looks like an inconsistency because they're portraying her just as a cold bitch to him and that doesn't even care about his approval, whereas that seems to be the opposite of what they portrayed her as in the original series, both as an adult and as a teenage child. The appearance of Camilla and some of the scenes she was in, I thought were excellent. I thought the actress that played Camilla was excellent. It was very, very authentic to the original, so that was a great job. Batista also seems very legit from the original. Maybe not exactly, but I did think he did a good job. Hopefully we'll see more character development as we go along that can clear that up a little bit more in my mind. But I think so far from what I've seen, it looks pretty good. I do think they are setting up Batista in the friendship with Dexter to be close so that it can maybe tie into what they're going to do in Dexter Resurrection when Batista finally has to confront Dexter. So that's just kind of a loose prediction that I have. Maybe that's why they're taking that angle. When I first thought about Batista, Masuka, and everything being in Miami Metro at the time Dexter was there, in my mind, I don't know how to quite put it into words, but it feels like the relationship Dexter would have had with Masuka and Batista would have been different in the original show, if he had been close to them that whole time. It doesn't feel like a closeness that you would have if you were working with someone for 20 years or so, but I don't know. I could be wrong on that. That's just me speculating in my mind. One other thought that I had that I just remembered is Dexter himself, young Dexter, and I was thinking about what is off about the way the actor's portraying him, because I couldn't quite see it in the first episode, but it's a little bit more clear in the second episode. Maybe some of the other listeners can maybe give their input on my thoughts, but I was thinking that Dexter is a little bit too, he's kind of got like this look in his eyes, like he's very, and I'm probably explaining this wrong, but he's a little bit too genuinely cheerful, happy for what I would think that Dexter would have been, even in the season 1 of Dexter, the original series. Dexter was someone who was very cold and dark inside, no emotions type of thing, and everything he did portray was faked. And Michael C. Hall did such an excellent job at portraying it in a way that that it looked like he was faking the emotions, and that's why a guy like Dokes could see through Dexter, because he knew Dexter was faking it. And that was really a pretty significant part of the storyline, both in the original show and in the book series, which is based, the show is based off of the book. So it just didn't strike me as that the character we're seeing now is faking the emotions. They seem a lot more genuine. And so, I don't know. That's just what strikes me when I watch this actor. I can't quite put it in the words, but maybe someone else can. Anyway, thanks for your show, and looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Hans. Great to hear from you. Hans sent this after episode 2 and has thoughts on 3 later on. Hans, you brought up the tofu dinner and some thoughts about eating red meat. Everyone's obviously entitled to choose what they want to eat, but we live in an age where information is everywhere. We're lucky in that way, but also so is misinformation. And of course, you can find evidence online to support the Earth being flat if you want. Respectfully, and I hope you don't mind and understand, I appreciate your view, but I had to edit your voicemail a little. It's, as I'm sure you're aware, it's an emotive subject and we don't want to risk inviting a debate about it here. But yes, I suppose it was the 90s when alternative diets became a lot more popular, and Deb trying to get Harry to eat tofu was a funny reference to this. I think his general dietary and lifestyle choices, his intense job and stress from what's happened and happening in his family were all contributing factors to his health issues. It wasn't specifically his diet, was it? There was all sorts going on. You can see where his heart attack came from. You bring up Deb and how she was freaking out when her positive memory of Harry was shattered, learning he'd had an affair. We just covered this in the last few weeks with our Season 3 rewatch. We certainly saw in flashbacks how Harry was far more attentive to Dexter than he was Deb, and we've talked about how she sometimes sought fatherly characteristics in her choice of partners, Frank Lundy in particular. We could say that maybe Deb could have been more vocal about how much she had to compete for Harry's attention. She certainly mentioned it at times, but his shortcomings there certainly inform her behaviour and choices later on. This is my opinion. I think Original Sin has so far been consistent with that. But to be fair to you, Hans, I'm responding here having already seen episodes 3 and 4. And they explore that a bit more, so I hope you're happier with this now. You're enjoying the portrayal of Camilla so far. I like her too. She's played by Sarah Kinsey, not an actor I'm familiar with, and looking at her IMDb page I can see why. I've not seen any of her previous work, and this is her biggest project so far. You're right about Batista. They could be spending time on his developing friendship with Dexter because we could be getting a face-off in Resurrection next summer, and this is going to serve as a fresh reminder of where they came from. Your point about the portrayal of young Dexter. We have seen glimpses of what we know is genuine emotion from him. We used to see it from him in the original series too, even in season 1, but a lot of his social interactions felt a bit forced, and I think we're getting that here too. He's making efforts to do what he can to fit in, as Harry is trying to teach him, but it's clumsy, and like his bad joke to Bobby about the heart attack, his humour falls short of the mark. He's still a very awkward person. However, Michael is the calibre of actor that he is, and he set a very high bar for anyone else following in his footsteps. Thanks, Hans. Loads of interesting thoughts there, and I hope to hear from you again. Nick Henderson's been in touch about both episodes. Apologies, Nick. I think I suggested you keep the feedback separate for the 2 episodes, and I've ended up covering the feedback in one podcast. I thank Paramount for that with their broadcast schedule. Here are your thoughts about episode 2 first.
Hey Gareth, Nick here. Before I dive into episode 2, Kid in a Candy Store, I just wanted to comment on something that I noticed a lot last week. The narrative framing of this show is obviously meant to be Dexter's life flashing before his eyes, but I am a little surprised by how literal everyone seems to be taking it, namely during the birthing scene. Admittedly, I do think that scene was unnecessary, but it doesn't really change the fact that this show is frequently going to delve into stories and interactions that Dexter wasn't actually privy to. If you ask me, Michael's voice is there to key us into the things that he explicitly remembers, but a lot of what's going on in the show is for the sake of the audience. If people are constantly questioning whether or not Dexter could remember every little thing, I think it's going to get exhausting. On a related note, I think there's also going to be some subtle differences that you're going to notice in scenes that already existed in the original series. My hope is that people can kind of loosen their grip on these things a bit, because creative liberties are definitely going to be taken for the sake of telling a new story and expanding the canon. It's just the nature of making a prequel. So anyways, that's my soapbox on that. I just noticed it a lot last week. Anyways, on to the episode itself. This was a fun one. The pacing seems to have evened out a bit since the pilot, which I think is great. And it was great to see Miami Metro featured so prominently. I am loving Sarah Michelle Gellar as Tanya Martin. I think she shines here, and that's not just because I'm also a huge Buffy nerd. I think Angel finally got some time to shine in this episode, and I'm really enjoying James Martinez in that role as well. I think those were kind of the two MVPs of this episode. The first crime scene was a really fun scene. I loved how he projected the bow onto the corpse. It's an effect we see a couple of times in this episode. They use it again at the end with him projecting that mugshot onto the bedroom ceiling. I love it. I hope they continue to use that. I think it kind of gives Original Sin some unique personality. I think Patrick also did a really great job, not only in the episode, but in this scene in particular, especially in regards to his facial acting. I loved the hazing from the rest of the team. It was awkward. It created some really fun, hilarious moments, but it never felt mean-spirited, and I think that's something that Dexter sort of picks up on. He even uses the word friends multiple times in the episode, so it's nice to see some of that humanity shine through, especially at this point in his life. I was actually really worried at one point that that aspect of the character wouldn't be nearly as obvious at this point in his life, and that as a result, he would be less endearing to the audience, but I really don't think that's the case. I also want to shout out to the fan theories that are now running rampant after this episode regarding the fella who approached him in the restaurant. A lot of people seem to think it might be his brother Brian, and while I'm not 100% on board for this yet, the guy certainly looks the part, and I got my brain working, so I'm starting to come around on it. The interaction itself, the camera lingered on it a split second too long, and it felt like an odd moment that Dexter didn't pick up on because he's not really a normal guy, but it felt weird to me, so I don't know. I mean, we even see Brian in a flashback later in the episode, so who knows if they're starting to kind of like plant the seeds for that. Just putting this out there, but I'm starting to also think about the kidnapper in a new light because of this theory. What if it's Brian? he's wearing a mask when we see him. And at this point, I'm starting to think that's kind of more for the benefit of the audience, not for his captive. I think it's supposed to be a mystery. And I think there might be some red herrings here, but I'm also wondering if maybe this is like, when we first meet Brian in the original series, he knows a lot about Dexter. He knows about the code. He knows how he operates. And I'm starting to wonder if this could be him trying to influence his brother into killing specifically by targeting a kid. This theory only really got stronger for me after watching episode 3, which we'll talk about in a separate voicemail. Because at this point, it seems like he kidnapped a kid, cut off his finger, and then killed him without ever making demands. It just feels like something that's really twisted that Brian might do for the sake of trying to coax out his brother's dark passenger. But hey, I know that's a bit of a stretch. Either way, I'm really excited to see where this kidnapping story goes. I hope they kind of keep that close to the vest for longer than maybe they did the Kirk Caldwell thing in New Blood. Because a good mystery is always great. Just think about the moment when you finally, I think it was like episode 8 or 9, maybe 8 of the original series, where we finally figured out that Brian was the ice truck killer. So I hope they kind of keep it close to the vest for a while. Anyways, sorry this was a long one. I'll keep the next one a little bit shorter, but episode 2 was good. I really enjoyed it. It feels like a necessary building block for the season, even if it didn't have a kill and it was kind of bouncing around a lot, showing a lot of different things. Most scenes felt important in some way or another. So, anyways, Kid in a Candy Store, fun episode. I've enjoyed it, and thanks again, Gareth, for everything you do. And I'll be back with another voicemail for episode 3, titled Miami Vice.
Thanks, Nick. You've reinforced something I touched on earlier about the leeway we need to give the writers. Creative liberties. Yeah. Thank you for that. It's a perfect phrase for it. You mentioned the kidnapper and whether it could be Brian. It could be. The ice truck killer didn't target kids, but he too will be refining his MO just like Dexter is, so we can't write him off. The mask is probably for our benefit rather than to protect their identity from the boy. Keeps a mystery to us about who it is. We know Brian's more messed up than Dexter, far more unhinged and not channeled by the code or protected to an extent by a loving father figure. Nick then sent in this about episode 3, Miami Vice.
Hey Gareth, Nick here. I'll keep this one short, I promise. I've actually only had a chance to watch episode 3 once so far because I'm still working my review for episode 2 over on Dexter Daily. All in all, I think this is maybe the best episode of the series so far. It started to really delve into Harry's past by touching on some of those dynamics that we never really got to see in the original series. It feels like those scenes are starting to approach new territory, and I think that's always welcome. I actually really enjoyed seeing Laura embrace her role as a CI and how that started to kind of create the bond between her and Harry. We didn't really get to see a lot of that in the original series, so really cool stuff. But Maria LaGuerta has entered the building, and I'm already really enjoying Christina Million's performance in the role. The department was clearly a boys' club in the 90s, as were a lot of places, and sexism and misogyny was rampant, but she held her own, as I kind of expected her to, and I look forward to seeing where she, or what they're going to do with her in future episodes. I'm also really digging the drama with the earrings, and how it kind of inadvertently landed Dexter a girlfriend. I like Sophia a lot so far, and I hope her confidence continues to kind of bring her a little too close to Dexter's secret life. I mean, that's the kind of drama that we're all here to see, right? But of course, this was an episode all about Dexter stalking his first victim after Nurse Mary, a bookie known as Handsome Tony Ferrer, I believe his name was, whose performance is really great, I might add, throughout this entire episode. I really enjoyed every scene he was in, especially any scene that he shared with Patrick. I think it was just great. I also really enjoyed seeing Dexter start to kind of stretch his legs here. When he first approaches Tony in that arena and kind of, is acting and everything. I think that was a great scene. It felt like classic Dexter, and I was captivated throughout. A little later on, there's that little routine he does with him in the alley where he tricks him into firing his gun so that he can pull the bullet and compare the striations to another murder victim. I think that was, again, classic Dexter. So, I love it whenever it does that. Gareth, you and I actually spoke a little bit about the sudden escalation for Dexter in this episode. So, him suddenly taking these huge risks after just one kill. And I do agree, it was, I wasn't expecting him to make such dramatic leaps in his brazenness after just one kill, but I'm also not upset because this episode just has so much going for it, and I'd argue that it kind of speaks to how cool and collected he is under pressure. I mean, in this episode alone, he's eating food out of his victim's fridge, he's, not panicking even when he thinks that he's about to get caught breaking into someone's house, and then, of course, there's the kill room, which he sets up in a very public space. And let me just say, this kill scene is destined to be one of my favorites. Patrick really dialed in his performance here, and as a set piece, it was just so much fun to watch, especially with him throwing the ball at him while he's leaned up against the wall. I think that was a really nice touch and a really cool way to kind of like lead into a scene like this. And, it almost seems like he gets a little too excited towards the end there and ends up making a way bigger mess than he intended. I mean, he gets blood in his mouth, which is really, really disgusting, but all in all, really cool scene, really enjoyable episode, slight nitpicks aside. I think the show is really starting to find its stride, and I can't see what comes next. And one more thing I forgot to mention. I really enjoyed kind of seeing Harry continue to grapple with everything, and he's very clearly in denial. But the dynamics continue to be really enjoyable to watch. Anyways, yeah, like I said, the show's starting to find its stride. I can't wait to see what comes next. I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else thinks. And until next week, cheers.
Hey, I'm Mark Pellegrino. I play Paul Bennett on Dexter, and you are listening to Dissecting Dexter with Gareth Watkins.
So yeah, Laura does seem to embrace her role as a CI and seems almost a little excited by it as it's doing well. You can see her and Harry getting closer, as we knew they would. I feel so bad for her though, because we know how it'll end, and also, I think, what you're playing at, Harry? What are you doing? You've got a grieving, suffering wife at home who needs your love and support, you douchebag. Is anyone bothered that young Brian and Dexter are older here than we saw them in flashbacks in the original series? They seem to be at an age where they'd be forming permanent memories, although maybe the trauma just left Dexter forgetting anything prior to the container. The boys are still quite a bit older than we saw before. Another creative liberty, I guess, and what choice have we got? We're going to have to go with it. As you said, Nick, Episode 3 gave us our introduction to Maria LaGuerta, played by Christina Milian. She, honestly, I think she looks perfect in the role, and her early swagger, asserting herself into a boys' club, was nicely done. Clearly she's going to butt heads with Spencer in a big way. Will she eventually be his undoing? Get him sacked? And in comes Tom Matthews. Perhaps that's how he'll be introduced as Spencer's replacement. She's being positioned as something of a crusader at the moment, sticking up for those the department would perhaps overlook when it comes to allocating resource to investigate crimes. We talked about NHIs last week, and she's clearly open-minded and completely inclusive with who she thinks is worthy of police time. You mentioned the earrings, Nick. The whole thing with these is pretty funny. I loved how they all thought Dexter was eyeballing Sophia during dinner, eyeing her up, when he was simply eyeballing his missing trophies. Gave everyone the wrong impression that he was reciprocating the interest Sophia had shown in him. Mamoon's email has left me thinking that she's not going to survive the season and will be his first innocent victim by proxy, the first person to die after getting too close to him. Let's talk a bit about Tony Ferrer. We saw him prominently in the trailer, and I love the actor's performance. He's perfect for the part. Their interaction at the game was great. You're right, Nick, saying it was classic Dexter. He would so often interact with his targets well before killing them, testing them out, getting a feel for them, gathering the evidence he needed to be sure, sticking to the code. The setting up of getting shot at so he could collect the bullet. I mean, that was really good thinking, if enormously bloody risky. But this supposedly emotionless Dexter doesn't know how to be afraid, does he? He lacks the common sense most of us would have. Nick, yes, you and I spoke privately after the episode, and I did express my surprise at how brazen he was with Ferrer, killing him in such a public space, even if it was after hours. He'd done it the right way with Mary, in a more familiar way that we're used to him seeing, in the quiet, somewhere where he's not likely to be disturbed, and it was in the security of her living room. Surely any night watchman or security guard might have walked in at any moment and caught him there. However, you're right, it really does make for a good set piece. Patrick was excellent, and the little slice on the cheek was, again, another little Easter egg for us, knowing what a part this will play in his eventual regular MO. Listener John Lewis emailed about spotting blood on the cheek in episode 1 too, which I'd missed. Dexter's full of self-confidence, though, isn't he? He is brazen and bold. What's the word? Emboldened, reinforced by the Mary kill, and he hasn't had the knockback of a failure yet. You mentioned him checking out Ferrer's house. It was a fun sequence. Eating food from the fridge. The talking parrot was a funny touch. I like that. He's got boldness of youth and an elevated sense of self-confidence and brashness brought on by his successful first kill. Thanks so much, Nick. And as he mentioned, you can read his full episode reviews at dexterdaily.com. Quick email from Deanna Tickle, who said of episode 3, the scene where Dexter brings a veggie tray to his co-workers was my favourite on this episode. It was classic Dexter. I'm the same age as Dexter and Deb, so the soundtrack and clothing gave me a sense of nostalgia. I owned a pair of shorts just like the ones Deb wore in this episode. This episode overall wasn't as great as episode 1, but I'm excited to continue. Thanks, Deanna. Trent Saunders emailed. He's a new listener and first-time feedbacker, which is great, and your thoughts are very welcome, my friend. Trent asks a question about Dr. Vogel, who we saw in Season 8. Had a big influence on the development of the code, and the inference was that she collaborated with Harry in putting it together. We've had no hint of her in this show yet. We know from back then that Harry tried sending young Dexter to therapy, and this is where he crossed paths with Dr. Vogel, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember this happened when he was much younger. No mention of her yet, but perhaps... maybe they'd be remiss not to mention her at all. Maybe Harry will get desperate and suggest Dexter goes back there. Moving on, our friend Hans sent another voicemail after episode 3 from his own mobile studio, which I love. Don't be afraid to do it again, Hans.
Dexter Original Sin, episode 3, Miami Vice. Introduction of Maria LaGuerta, and looks like from the start she received her job by doing some shady things, which that's definitely consistent with her character, and hopefully I really do hope they portray her as the bad guy that she really was. Of course, she didn't meet Dexter's code deserving to die, but she was still a bad guy in the sense that she would just always be seeking to screw everyone over for her own gain. So hopefully they stay consistent with the course on that one. And I do, if I was going to make a prediction, I would probably predict that they're going to try to spin the whole sexist man is bad, female is a victim type of mentality that frequently gets pushed in society, which I really hope they lay off of that angle, but I really think they're probably going to do something like that with it and try to make men look stupid and they're just sexist and things of that nature. But at least for now, they're showing her as someone who's not a good person, shady from the start. I am going to say I really love the all the nostalgia stuff, it is just my favorite part of the show. Even the details of like people leaving handwritten notes, handwritten calendars. The computer that Dexter is working on is clearly a computer, or at least it looks like it, from the 90s. The capabilities it would have, the type of screen it would look like in the early 90s. I think 91, that would have probably have been before Windows, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, good job on that with the show. One thing I find odd, which I also found odd with the original show, was the department's really lax attitude toward doing really shady stuff, and the fake ID thing with Masuka is one of those things. Just openly talking about things that are not legal. Masuka did that frequently in the original show, so I think it's good that they're being consistent with that, but at the same time, it is just so odd that that stuff could go on openly and no one said anything about it. Like Masuka's talk in the original show about hiring hookers and things like that would land people in jail. The actual homicide department just openly engages in that type of talk, which is just bizarre. But I do find Masuka's behavior, mannerisms, attitude, very excellent acting, very consistent with the original character. I think he's doing an excellent job, both from the writer's perspective and the actor. One thing I was thinking about as I watched this episode is, wouldn't Batista, Masuka, and LaGuerta have talked a little bit more about Harry Morgan and their relationship with him if they had worked with him so closely and for so long? I don't know if I'm way off on this thought, but it seemed like Tom Matthews was really the only one in the original show that really spoke much about working with Harry, but not any of the others. Another possible inconsistency that I see between the original series and what we're seeing here in episode 3, Harry is acting as if he thought it was enough for Dexter to just have the one kill and then have the job at Miami Metro, and he was hoping that would just be enough where he wouldn't need to keep doing it anymore. Well, how does that really make any sense for him to have taught him the code then? Because teaching him the code assumes that it's going to be continuous kill after kill. The reason you teach a code is because you're expecting him to keep doing it. It assumes that he's going to be doing this for the rest of his life. So, if it was just a one-time thing that he was expecting and hoping for, then he wouldn't have taught him the code in the first place. So, I'm assuming he had already been taught the code at this stage, so it kind of doesn't make sense in my mind why he's so baffled that it's not just a one-time thing. And another thing I was thinking about was, when did Dexter learn how to fight and all those skills that he used against Dokes and other people? Because from what we've seen so far, he kind of just was, when he fought the guy that was trying to date rape Deb, he didn't really have the same kind of fighting skills. So when did he learn those skills? Was it maybe after the events of this season, or what? I'm hoping that maybe this season will reveal that. Anyway, sorry that the audio wasn't very consistent on this. I was recording in the vehicle and in places in the home just as thoughts popped into my head. So, hope you had a great Christmas, and I'm looking forward to hearing the show.
Thanks, Hans. Christmas has been good. Hope you've had a good one too. We've already talked a bit about the male-dominated workplace, haven't we? And that how this was often the norm back in the early 90s, and how women had to really struggle and fight to break through the glass ceiling. And the police force was no exception, of course, and it's fair to them to depict Miami PD in the way they have so far. Some may argue, and I said this last time, good drama should be challenging, and, people don't always like being presented with an uncomfortable truth. Some may argue that it's right that the department should be presented in this way, even with characters we like. I don't honestly remember LaGuerta as a bad person as such in the original series. I think she was certainly presented as someone who'd had to fight tooth and nail to get where she is, and we saw she could be ruthless sometimes. She was certainly unkind to Deb in the early days, a bit hostile, but that softened in the end. She ended up being an antagonist when she was on Dexter's case, although, as you said, she didn't fit the code. But she was doing what a detective should do, investigate, and she was certainly right to be on to Dexter. You could say she's being shown to be a little self-righteous in her public mission to improve the performance of the department. However, it could also be argued that she's just ambitious and determined, which are not bad qualities for a leader, regardless of gender. I do think she could end up costing Spencer his job. Maybe she'll call him out for the poor crime-solving rates, or for not investigating cases based on NHIs, and he'll have to resign. Then in comes Tom Matthews to replace him. She's still young though, and I'm not sure she maybe cares too much about who she has to tread on to get ahead. But we're well aware of how the system was in those days, and it encourages people to be ruthless if they want to succeed. However, she also needs to be good at her job, and I hope we'll see she's that as well. A genuinely good detective, as well as someone who's willing to play the political game. But your concern is valid, being worried that they'll make all the men look stupid and sexist. We know not everyone's going to be like that. They're just working in the system and within the social norms of the time. But if anyone does get their comeuppance, I hope it's because they properly deserve it. They need to maintain a realistic balance in the show. Well, say what you like about the controversial elements of the show so far, but it's definitely given us some good stuff to think about, isn't it? I agree with you, Hans, about some of the shadier stuff we see going on, like Masuka with the fake ID, doing that so openly. I'm guessing it wouldn't happen so openly today, but it's kind of funny seeing people in law enforcement doing this sort of dodgy stuff. I love that Dexter chose Patrick Bateman as his pseudonym. You're also right about the original show and who made much reference to Harry in Miami PD. We're seeing that they all worked with him, but it was only really Matthews who talks about him in the original show. Another inconsistency and an issue that the writers probably discussed when producing the show. But I think the show itself is richer for having younger versions of Dexter colleagues than having an almost all-new team to get to know. It makes for better TV, in my book, so I'm happy to overlook it. You bring up a point about Harry and how he was obviously hoping Nurse Mary would be enough, and then the job in forensics would keep the itch at bay after that. He was naive though, and we see the realisation in Christian Slater's performance. He's not happy to accept it, but you bring up the code, and why the code was necessary if he never thought Dexter would end up a full-blown serial killer. It's a chicken and egg thing, isn't it, which came first? Maybe it was an insurance policy. Voiceover Dexter keeps referring to it, but that's meant to be Dexter in the present, looking back. When exactly did they lay out the code, or was it something they just talked about hypothetically that ended up actually being necessary? It brings in Vogel's involvement too, which I thought was when Dexter was younger than 20. Definitely some retconning going on, and we've got no choice but to go with it. Lots of good stuff here, Hans. You mentioned Dexter's combat skills. He can really handle himself, can't he? That leg sweep in episode 1 was enough to make us think he'd had some training. Perhaps he had karate classes as a kid, or Harry taught the kids some self-defense stuff in the yard. It's not been accounted for, but he's handy enough to be better than the average person. Okay, we also had a message from our friend Andrea, who asks, was that Brian Moser in the restaurant asking to sit with Dexter? I feel like the man was too distinct to not be important to the story. In the flashback when Harry meets Dexter, Brian looked at him for a long time. Maybe there will be a Harry-Brian storyline. It would make sense Harry wouldn't totally abandon Brian. The term NHI, no humans involved. This is similar to a storyline in Succession regarding their cruise ships. That's all I will say in case you haven't seen the show. Is this a commonly used term? We didn't hear it in the original show, so will it be changed in the future to acknowledge the dignity of the victims? It doesn't seem like just a passing comment since Dempsey used in and then Batista explained it. Maybe Harry will ask for it to be changed if this is how they refer to crime scenes where Laura Moser is murdered. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Speaking of, I'm so interested to see how this storyline plays out from Harry's perspective. People have criticised, saying there isn't a story to tell, but I have to disagree. It's also interesting how the voiceover reflects on why seeing dismembered body parts was so impactful to himself, but at that age he couldn't understand why. Will we see a young Miguel Prado? It was mentioned he and Maria had a significant romantic relationship. Speaking of, I think LaGuerta and Matthews, introduced later, will take out Dempsey together. What is with the young Dexter casting? That child is at least 5, possibly a large 4-year-old with a birthday around the corner. According to the calendars, it's January 1973, which would make him almost 2. This doesn't usually bother me if it makes sense for the role, but shouldn't they be less specific with all the dates so you don't have to think about it? I enjoyed watching Batista and Dexter's friendship beginnings. This will be especially interesting if Batista is in Resurrection, as the end of New Blood suggests. Thanks, Andrea. Some good thoughts and best wishes of the season to you too. Thank you for your seasonal greetings. A lot of your thoughts there echo those that we've talked about already today. Will we see a young Miguel Prado? Yes, we could. Although, I don't know, I don't think this has been renewed for a season 2, if we're going to get a season 2. If we're not, then it's quite possible we'll see a young, maybe attorney's assistant called Miguel Prado at some point later in the season. You ask about the NHI term. Yes, it was a thing. It was a thing back then, and we talked about this on the last podcast, so I'm sure you've heard that by now. Thanks, Andrea. Finally, I had a response from someone in the know. If you remember, I think it was, wasn't it, episode 1, I raised the question about Dexter not getting his hands on an actual cadaver until right at the end of his course. And I said, is this normal for pre-med? Whether they don't get to dissect an actual cadaver until right at the end, it just seemed odd to me. And whether that was realistic. Robin on Facebook messaged to say most students don't work with human cadavers until they're in the first year of med school. Undergraduates take anatomy and physiology, but work on pigs. Similar to humans are less expensive. Dead humans don't bleed because there's not a beating heart to pump the blood. Sometimes corpses are depicted as bleeding, but this is a huge technical error. I'm a psychology professor who was a pre-med student until I realised I really didn't like organic chemistry. I'm loving your podcast. Thanks, Robin. I really appreciate you getting in touch, and it's good to have an answer to that question that I raised from someone in the know. And that's all we've got this time. If you want to drop me a line about episode 4, there's still time. dissectingdexter@gmail.com is the address. You can also find me on Twitter @DissectDexter, or Blue Sky as Dissecting Dexter, or Facebook.com/DissectingDexter. You can support me by leaving a nice 5-star review on iTunes, Spotify, or whichever podcast app you use. And if you want to go the whole hog and help cover the podcast running costs, you could subscribe at patreon.com/dissectingdexter for as little as £1 a month. And my sincere thanks go to all those who help out in that way. As I always say, your support means so much and genuinely helps the podcast. I do not take it for granted. Thank you. Episode 3 was great, I thought. IMDb has it as the highest rated out of the first 3 episodes, and it's deserved. It moved everything forward nicely and maintains my anticipation for what's to come. But I'll get going now and just wish you all a very happy and peaceful new year. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back in a few days to dissect episode 4 together, with episode 5 hot on its heels, and we'll get back onto a more regular podcast schedule very soon. There'll be a week's hiatus in mid-January, it turns out, with no episode. Paramount have fiddled because of scheduling for the premiere of the new Yellow Jackets season, apparently. Thanks again for listening. Bye for now.